You're with Julian on the Brown Note, and the Venezuelan elections, were they fact or fiction? So I did used to focus on more politics on this show than the USA, Australia and the UK, in fact, quite frequently. And Venezuela was one of the most featured countries that I featured on this show. And I'll probably split this into two with a song in the middle because it is long and wordy. So Venezuela has been marked out for special treatment like a number of other countries since the advent of Hugo Chavez, who was the socialist leader of Venezuela from 1999 to 2013. His tenure in office was continually marked by election interference and sanctions and demonizing from the United States of America. Why would that have been the case? Well, this is a list of the top 10 oil-producing nations in the world. Sorry, the ones with the most reserves left of oil. At 10, Nigeria. At 9, Libya. What happened in Libya? Regime overthrow. Russia, one of our besties. The UAE, friends. At number 7. At number 6, Kuwait, friends. At number 5, Iraq. At number 4, Iran. Number 3, Canada, friends. Number 2, Saudi, friends. And the country in the world with the greatest oil reserves of 300 billion or something left, Venezuela. Now, we all know why the Iraq War happened. And we all know that the fight between countries like China and the USA to have access to oil with dwindling supplies has been one of the dominant driving forces of global politics since America made friends with Saudi Arabia in the 1940s. And you'll notice throughout that list, virtually every single country was a friend or an enemy. And several of them have been subject to overthrow in Iraq, in Libya. And God knows they've tried their hardest in Iran. But they've also tried their hardest in Venezuela. And one of the key points about Venezuela is, much like Cuba, which has been punished ever since it went down its socialist path, Venezuela decided not to sell its oil rights to foreign multinational companies, particularly American global giants. And that, my friend, is American democracy bombers on your way, which they've never done yet. They've just simply tried to support every overthrow of every government election, and every time that they've had a very right-wing pro-privatization candidate, they've supported them, which has led to a similar situation in Cuba or Venezuela being subject to incredible sanctions, which bear very little legitimacy, which in turn has ground the country into as much dust as America can muster. It's worth pointing out that none of these nations, like Cuba, like Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, and like Venezuela, were even anti-American. They just wanted to have ownership of the country for the people. And that is probably the biggest crime on the international stage that you can commit under the last 100 years of American hegemony in the world. You can be a totalitarian dictator responsible for mass murder and still be America's friend and still be a friend of the West. If you start saying that you're going to keep ownership of your oil and make sure that the benefits of that go to increasing public education, public healthcare, and so on, you are worse than that mass murdering tyrant. There has been a very specific kind of opposition in Venezuela that America has supported. Currently, there are opposition leaders in Venezuela that don't support selling their oil to foreign multinationals. Those aren't the ones America supports. They support the ones that are keen on privatization. And despite these enormous economic and political impacts on Venezuela, you never hear how far ahead of their capitalist, even though they are very capitalist, but their neoliberal capitalist compadres in Latin America have performed when it comes to access to public healthcare, literacy, education, housing, and so on, which Venezuela has continually done very well against the other failing countries in Latin America. There's been an enormous amount of corruption and mismanagement, but there's also been an enormous amount of corruption and mismanagement in countries that America's very good friends with. So it's a farce to say that that's the reason in this country, particularly. So the big problem they had in Venezuela recently was the death of Hugo Chavez, father of the modern nation of Venezuela. And it's important to note, had Chavez not been in power, in my opinion, the country would have done far worse. And you only have to look at the countries around it in Central America, where America has more influence, to see how much worse they could have done. There's no indication that they would have done better. But when he died, Nicolás Maduro had to take over, and that was when America really sniffed its chance by massively pummeling the government as much as possible with sanctions to make life in the country unbearable and to drive support for the opposition. And it hasn't worked so far. So he died in 2013, so it's 11 years now since Maduro has been in power. And this is a look at the current election from July 28th, which is a controversial election because it happened in Venezuela. And this is from an independent Latin American journalist from Venezuela called Rodrigo Acuna. On the 28th of July, a presidential election took place in Venezuela, expected to be one of the closest in years. Soon after midnight, the National Electoral Council, or the CNE, declared that with 80% of the vote counted, incumbent leftist President Nicolás Maduro won by 51.2% to 44.2% against the ultra-right candidate Edmundo González, with a voter turnout of just 60%. Still, González stood for far-right opposition figure Maria Corina Machado after she was banned by the Supreme Court for supporting harsh US economic sanctions against Venezuela. Immediately after the Electoral Council announcement, Machado claimed González won with 70% of the vote. Now, this is a figure that Western media has been trotting around with absolutely no evidence whatsoever. Venezuela's got a new president-elect, and it's Edmundo González. We won, and the whole world knows it, said Machado in a joint statement. With the Electoral Council declaring it suffered a massive cyber attack during the election, the electoral body noted Venezuelan journalist Andrina Chavez Alva did not release results broken down by the voting center on its website, which remains out of service. Electoral Council authorities have denounced an ongoing cyber attack that's delayed vote tallying operations. By the 1st of August, US Secretary of State Antony J. Blinken declared that the government of the United States congratulated González on his successful campaign. Despite them not having any evidence that he won, they have announced that he is leader, adding it was now time for Venezuelan parties to discuss on a respectful, peaceful transition. Despite this being the 20th election since the late since late President Hugo Chavez won office in 1998 and commenced the Bolivarian Revolution, much of the mainstream media has supported the opposition's narrative because, as in all countries, there is no left-wing media. These are corporations who make the media, unless you're a public broadcaster. Speaking to the brilliant online resource ZNet, Alan McLeod, a journalist who covered the elections from Caracas, said the international media have largely lionized González as the grandfather of the nation who can unite the people. While many mention he retired from diplomatic service in 2002, few noted the reason for this. He was forced out in shame after supporting a far-right coup against the government, and this is the supporter of Machado, the opposition candidate. Asked about Machado, McLeod said, few media outlets mention Machado's participation in the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez, nor the fact that her career has been consistently bankrolled by the US government. Her organisation, Sumarte, for example, was funded by the notorious National Endowment for Democracy. I believe that was the organisation that had massive ties to American interference in Latin American countries in the 80s. In 2018, Mercado wrote a letter to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu beseeching him to head a foreign military intervention in Venezuela. So why have Gonzalez and Mercado been more successful this time in claiming fraud? Despite the presence of hundreds of international observers in Venezuela, which you don't read about either. The head of the US mission for Venezuela was asked if any opposition candidate would satisfy the Biden administration. And Palmieri's reply was clear and simple. We have and continue to support Maria Corina Machado as the candidate of the Democratic opposition. Many of the other opposition candidates were far more suitable and qualified, but not all of those supported privatization. Currently, 7 opposition candidates, as well as Maduro, have presented their records to the Supreme Court after it ordered a full investigation into the election results. And the Electoral Council claims of a massive cyber attack. After the elections, while both pro-government supporters and members of the opposition have been able to pull large numbers of demonstrators in their favour throughout the country and have been overwhelmingly peaceful, it has been the supporters of the right-wing opposition whose images have been getting widespread media coverage as they engage in street battles with local authorities. Worshipped by the media as heroes standing up to an authoritarian government, the Guaramberos are balaclava-wearing youths whose Molotov cocktails and other homemade weapons are overwhelmingly hired from the slums by the far right to burn and damage government infrastructure. They've got little in common with their fellow middle-class or upper-middle-class Venezuelans who want to see an end to the Maduro administration. According to journalist Ben Meir on the social platform Twitter, after the election was declared, among a list 12 universities, 7 public schools, 21 elementary schools, 37 public health centres, 6 public food distribution centres, 11 Caracas metro stations, and 27 monuments were attacked or destroyed by these right-wing supporters. By 13th of August, so 2 weeks after the election, the country's Attorney General Tariq William Saad reported 25 dead and 192 having been injured. So there's a lot of conjecture about the results of this election, and the fact that the National Election Council has given the results but hasn't given the breakdown of each individual seat has fed fuel to the opposition right-wingers to say that it's fraudulent, and the National Election Council has said that they're under a massive cyber attack. Jimmy Acosta, another supporter of Maduro, said that the large demonstrations in favour of the government highlighted the backing of the Bolivarian revolution and has sent a clear message to the opposition and the international community. Well, it's not really getting through to the international community very much. Estimates for the Center of Economic and Policy Research in Washington note that due to the impact of US sanctions, some 40,000 deaths from 2017 to 18 occurred. As of 2024, the United Nations claims 7.7 million Venezuelans have left the country, making it the largest exodus in Latin America's recent history. For the next coming weeks, attention will continue to turn towards the Supreme Court and its investigation into the election. And that's where we're at the moment. On August the 22nd, the Venezuelan Supreme Court issued its judgment about the validity of the Electoral Council's official result, agreeing that it is valid. However, the official voting centre tallies have not been announced. And I did miss off a bit because it was so long. And I'll come back after this song about the fact that the sanctions are biting so hard now that there has been a splintering of support away from Maduro and from the leftist incumbent government, but there hasn't been any proof of any electoral victory by the opposition. I'll come back after Beth Gibbons for sale. On the brown notes and continuing Venezuela fact or fiction in the recent July 28th, I think, elections. So there's no indication officially that the Maduro leftist government, the incumbent since 98, have lost the election. But it's been widely promulgated around the world. Now, there's a certain amount of irony with the way that the Western world treats Venezuela's elections, which is, if you look at the recent American elections, there have been quite a few allegations of fraud. And there has been quite a lot of protesting about the winners or losers of the elections in America as well. In fact, it was one of the only times that Donald Trump talked about going to war during his tenure in office was that he talked about going to war in Venezuela. And he recently said that he was going to fly to Venezuela if he lost the election. I'm sure they'll be welcoming him with open arms. And when we talk about Venezuela, we hold them to a standard that other nations that we are on friendly terms with or support or back aren't held to. If you look at Haiti or Grenada or places like Honduras, and the absolute collapse of virtually everything connected with a normal society in those countries, they're never held up as being a result of those countries refusing to privatize their industries like oil. In fact, we welcome them as friends and say they need support. There is one crucial factor involved, and that is Venezuela seeking to keep ownership of its oil to benefit the public. And for that, they have remained an international pariah. Now, I just wanted to read some of this BBC piece from today to show how incredibly biased our Western mainstream media is in reporting on Venezuela. The US has seized a plane belonging to Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, claiming it was bought illegally for $13 million smuggled out of the country. A spokesperson for the White House said the action represented an important step to ensure that Maduro continues to feel the consequences from his misgovernance of Venezuela. Misgovernance? How many nations in the world do we hold to account for misgovernance and impound their jets for misgovernance? I would say that quite a few countries around the world would suffer the same fate if we held them to that standard. The US officials said the jet had been used by Maduro to visit other countries. The Venezuelan government announced in July it was suspending commercial flights to both the Dominican Republic and Panama following the controversial re-election of Maduro. Venezuela's opposition has released polling data which suggests its unity candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez won a convincing victory. Now, that's not been recognised by anybody. How many opposition leaders get to run the narrative and say that they've won an election without having any official body? It's worth pointing out that Jimmy Carter, the US president, actually said that the Venezuelan elections about 10-15 years ago were the fairest he'd seen in the world. And that's not the case now, but those elections were still hammered by the West as being unfair. Several Latin American countries have withheld their support, with Maduro's former ally, President Lula of Brazil, who's under attack from Elon Musk at the moment, among those calling for full transparency. Now, he hasn't not supported Maduro's position. He has said that it should be that the Electoral Council releases all the results, which is the position of the Venezuelan government as well. And they've said they're under an enormous cyber attack and can't do so at the moment. But the official Electoral Council has said that Maduro won 51 point something to 44%. And the opposition says they won by 70%. This is not the first time Maduro or Venezuela's government has been targeted by US authorities. They charged him with narco-terrorism, corruption and drug trafficking. And the State Department has offered a reward for $15 million for information leading to Maduro's arrest. Now, we are in bed in the West and have been for decades with so many dictators that have caused mass murder in their countries and that have sold all of their country's assets and go and live in Switzerland. And they're our friends. But Venezuela's crime has always been the same, which is that it tries to keep assets owned by the country, not by foreign multinationals, particularly not by American foreign multinationals, and seeks to use the money from those, as hard as that's proven to be, to benefit their healthcare infrastructure and so on. And we never let these people, whether it's Ho Chi Minh, whether it's Fidel Castro, we force these people into this tiny corner and punish them forever until their countries are broken. And we often don't do so just because we say they're friends of Russia. They're often not friends of Russia. But this time there's an interesting twist. There hasn't been as much political outcry from Western nations about the election result. I wonder if that's because the wars in Gaza and Ukraine have sapped the West's desire to actually engage on another front. But also, we now have the BRIC nations. And the BRIC nations is shaping up to be the largest economic bloc on earth. And they are made up of Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And their combined GDP will soon dwarf America or the European Union. And Venezuela is very much part of this equation. So they have some new friends in high places. And I do wonder whether that's part of the whole equation as well. But what we've seen in Venezuela is unlikely to result in Maduro being overthrown. I imagine that the results, when they come out, will actually validate the Electoral Council, because no one's calling the Electoral Council part of some hideous scheme to defraud the electorate in Venezuela, who are still apparently protesting for Maduro far in numbers of the anti-Maduro pro-right-wing candidate. I've seen many pictures over the years of these protests against the socialist government of Venezuela, which were often proven to be rich people sending their maids out to stand by Land Rovers and protest. The idea that we want better for Venezuela for the public is so offensive. We want their oil, and we want the threat of a good example, to quote Noam Chomsky, about a country actually trying to utilize its own assets, and we don't like that. So I imagine that the elections were fair, and where the cyber attacking is coming from, that we will find out. And good luck to Maduro in keeping out the right-wing international globalist monster.